Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 6. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. We'll start out with some news. Google Cloud accidentally deletes UniSuper's online account due to unprecedented misconfiguration. And there are a few different articles in the press about this one.
A trigger warning for you admins out there, because this is some nightmare fuel to me. UniSuper is an Australian, I believe, pension account that has something about 135 billion worth of funds. So they have some weight to throw around. And they have a presence on Google Cloud, particularly through the VMware engine. So they're using Google Cloud VMware engine. And it seems that a employee was using an internal tool to administrate these VMware engine instances and somehow deleted UniSuper's account, which includes all of their compute resources. That is a big mess up. The details aren't that prevalent here. There was some analysis done by some software engineers to say, the explanations here don't really make sense. Google did come up after and come out with a plan about what had happened and how can we do it to prevent it. They have since deprecated the tool to prevent this from happening in the future, but they were in trouble, man. They said data backups that were stored in the Google Cloud storage and in the same reason were not impacted by the deletion. But in reality, what it seems to be is that the third-party backup software they're using were the real reason they were able to save data and restore at all.
When you say an employee, do you mean a Google employee did something or a UniSuper employee did something?
A Google employee. Good question.
That's a pretty big mistake, isn't it, when you're talking $130 billion?
I believe, if I read this correctly, what had happened was they had provisioned this Google VMware Cloud Engine instance as like a free trial. You have 30 days, whatever. And then they kept on going. But the initial implementation of the account was under this tool that they use for deploying these trial accounts, and that apparently someone didn't hit something correctly in that internal thing, and after a certain period of time, deleted everything.
I saw something in there about a blank configuration value or something having to do with it. I mean, is this an inherent problem when you try to over-automate everything, that one small mistake or misconfiguration can do so much damage?
I mean, I think Google's entire customer service is a lesson in not over-automating everything because it's completely rubbish most of the time.
Does this tell you why you shouldn't have all of your stuff with one cloud provider?
Definitely. This should be a wake-up call to many of us. UniSuper, it sounds like they had cross-regional backups, which would be, already pretty good, but that did not help them here. Everything was wiped in every region. So I have to say, fair play to UniSuper's engineers for having thought about this and having an option. Because I imagine a lot of us maybe have some eggs in one basket right now and there might be sweating bullets a bit because this can happen. And if it's going to happen to $130 billion fund, it's going to happen possibly to your Facebook for Dogs startup. And I'm sure as hell Google Cloud aren't going to be doing a joint apology about that.
I don't know if I necessarily buy that this is a single cloud provider issue, though. I think this is a single organization or single set of accounts in a cloud provider issue. If they'd done something like backup to a separate Google account that sat outside of their Google organization, that also might have mitigated it whilst allowing them to stay within just GCP, right? And that's always been my suggestion to customers is if you're running an organization, make sure you're backing up to somewhere outside of that for some kind of DR plan.
So you would say regardless of which cloud provider target, it could be the same cloud provider as long as it's outside of that organization within that provider?
Yeah, separate organization, separate email domain, separate set of logins, different SSO provider. Keep it entirely separate. And the only thing that account can do is pull backups from your existing account.
If you're going to keep everything separate there, what's the advantage in not making it completely separate and making sure you've got no crossover by moving it to a different account? Is it that you can use the same tools and things?
Yeah, all of your tooling works, right? So let's say in AWS, for example, you're creating an EBS snapshot. You can replicate that EBS snapshot to a different account. It doesn't necessarily have to be within your organization. And then you've got that in its little safe haven off to one side. So you're not introducing additional tooling or moving the backups to something like file level. You're still handling all of that at the block level using the cloud provider's native tooling, but it is at least outside of the accounts where your big production stuff is running.
Do you think that's still enough, or would you still then have a different cloud account or an on-prem tape, backup of your data if someone at that cloud provider completely screwed up and just destroyed everything and replicated it everywhere?
Well, I feel like if a cloud provider destroyed data for multiple customers across multiple regions, then you've got wider issues anyway.
Half the internet's gone.
But I guess it depends on the risk appetite of your business.
Yeah, I suppose most backup strategies are trade-offs, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, you can all say that you should follow 3-2-1 backup strategy, but how many of us are actually doing that with all of our data at all times? I can't say that I am.
Is there tooling, and is anyone aware of tooling within some of these cloud providers to let you, like as UniSuper had, like they had cross-regional backups within the same account, I'm assuming. Is there tools out there to make it easy to do cross-account backups or cross-organization accounts? If I'm going to stick everything into the same cloud provider, I'd hope they're going to make my life easier, even if it's outside of the organization.
In the AWS world, the AWS backup tooling does that for you. It can do cross-region, cross-account backups. There's a few gotchas there with things like encryption, but you can get around most of that.
Like shared keys.
Yeah, shared keys. I think it's mainly if you're using AWS managed keys, it gets a little bit tricky because obviously those are provisioned per account. But if you're using customer managed keys, it's not so much of a problem.
Yeah, that's probably a fairly healthy stopgap. I'm just going, screw my current cloud provider. I'm just going to go somewhere else for my backups. So makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, most companies are single cloud vendor, right? So getting something spun up in GCP and then finding a way to replicate your data over there is probably going to make you fall back to slightly more traditional methods like a ZFS send or rsync or something like that, which you may or may not want to be doing.
Microsoft's carbon emissions up nearly 30% thanks to AI. I think this was in the register. Now, to be fair, I went back and read, or at least skimmed, the underlying Microsoft report, and to me it didn't precisely say that the increase was because of AI, but there were lots of mentions of AI, and obviously there's been quite a lot of growth in AI in that. But I thought that the broader discussion of the sustainability of AI and AI in the cloud, ML, whatever you want to call it, particularly with the rise of generative AI, was worth a quick discussion and to hear your thoughts on where that's going and whether this is a solvable problem.
So yeah, you mentioned that they didn't specifically call out AI, but the timelines of Q3 and 4 last year certainly match up with when the Gen AI, and I guess more generically AI, hype train kind of really took off match. So I think it probably is pretty easy to attribute it to AI services. And I think it's quite clear that this has happened across all of the clouds. I know Google's recent sustainability reports indicated similar things.
It's a little disappointing to see because I think a lot of the cloud providers have good sustainability objectives and they're doing good work, like AWS and GCP now, and perhaps Azure, I'm not sure, have those ARM processes for reducing the energy usage. So they were making progress and chipping away at this, but this has sort of reset the bar again. And I worry that some of their sustainability objectives are going to get undermined by AI in the future. I wonder if the AI team are now having to answer to the sustainability team, or is the sustainability team going to have to start figuring out some new clever maths to sell that AI is worth this environmental cost.
Yeah, you're right. It's beyond just the electricity. There's the water, there's the minerals, there's all sorts of things that are involved in building these chips and keeping them running. And I think it's unhelpful in some ways that the Microsoft report put a section on AI in every single one of their sustainable kind of levels that I saw anyway, where they're talking about water and then they talk about AI there and so forth. And it all felt a little bit indirect to me. It felt a bit like saying that cars are good for the environment because they get environmentalists to work a bit faster. There's definitely advantages there. There's definitely ways that this technology is helping people do their work and do modeling in different ways, but it didn't feel exactly like it was going to magically create the next solution to the environmental apocalypse, just because somebody asked a Gen AI tool for the answer.
Yeah, it's tricky. You've seen this in the past, right? Let us crap all over the planet now, and then down the line we'll have the magic beans to solve all this later.
Right. All these companies are trying to say we'll be there, we'll be carbon negative, we'll be water positive by 2030, but the results are not there yet. They're increasing their usage, they're not decreasing. Google went up 20%, Microsoft went up 34%. I mean, the amount of water these people are using is absurd. 7, almost 8 million cubic meters. That's 2 billion gallons. That's so much water. And it looks like people are starting to take note because there are people that live near these data centers, like in Iowa and in Las Vegas, that they are noticing that this is causing problems and they are trying to pass ordinances in their areas to try to curtail this usage. But who's going to win? These small people or Microsoft and Google's lawyers? That's a tough spot to be in.
And I do want to call out that these companies at least do have these sustainability goals. They are creating these reports and reporting on it. So I don't want to be too negative about the fact that they're putting this information out there for people to look at. There was a McKinsey report that I can drop into the notes as well, that the overall tenor felt like they thought AI would be helpful to solving the environment's problems. But again, all of the things they were suggesting felt a little bit indirect and a little bit one step removed from the underlying problems.
I'd put a little bit of a twist though on these reports. Like, the companies here are operating at such a scale where the impact of their decisions will be felt planet-wide, and it's not a case of we should be grateful they're producing these reports. They should be obligated to produce these reports, and they should be obligated to be making progress on this, because again, we're selling ourselves down the river if they just continue to transparency is great, but transparently report that they are killing the planet faster, essentially.
I think the other thing to consider here is that a lot of the consumers of these AI solutions from the big cloud providers are thinking about things like data residency or copyright concerns or importing open source code into their projects. But what I'm not hearing a lot of is people building environmental concerns into their sustainable or responsible AI policies. And I think that's a really tricky thing, because there isn't exactly statistics out there about, if I ask ChatGPT to write a tweet for me, it's using X liters of water or burning X number of trees, right? It's a really tricky thing, in the same way that energy providers will now say you've used 20 car journeys worth of electricity this month or whatever in terms of CO2 emissions. I feel like there should be more transparency at a service level to tell you exactly the environmental impact of your AI use. And I understand that's a tricky thing, but as usage of this goes up, I feel like it's only going to get worse unless people start getting visibility on exactly the level of emissions or whatever it is that their Gen AI use is giving them.
Yes, I think it needs to be next to the person who's making the decision, and it needs to be in a term that they can understand. So it doesn't mean a lot to me if someone tells me how many tons of CO2 I'm using. That doesn't really mean much to me personally. And I think, as you say, it would be much more meaningful to me if that was like 6 months of a tree or something in those kind of more real terms.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking something like when you book a train now, it says you've used 4 kilos of CO2. That's the equivalent to X number of miles driven in a car as a single person. And that's something that I can equate to, because I understand what driving a 1,000-mile journey is. I don't necessarily understand what X number of kilos of CO2 is.
Yeah, and maybe when I'm sitting down and trying to get some generative AI to sing the words of the GPL in the style of punk rock, that won't seem like such a cool idea if I know that I'm burning half a forest to do it.
Yeah, there's just be a graphic of like a forest just slowly burning. you type more and more lyrics out, right? That'll be motivating in the right direction.
Something I thought was interesting is I saw a reference somewhere, and I can drop it in for people who are curious, that the costs to inference ChatGPT exceed the training costs on a weekly basis. So I think we hear a lot in the environmental world about the costs of training these giant models, the huge amount of power that goes into training these giant models. But you don't hear quite so much about inference. But as these have seen such big usage, it looks like that is indeed a really big part of the equation as well.
I think it's probably because we're only just at the start of the inference journey, right? So there are a bunch of big models that have been trained, and that's been happening for a few years, whereas people are only just starting to consume some of those big models, certainly at any meaningful scale. So I'm not entirely sure that we've fully understood the cost of the inference on those models until now, when people have really started doing it over the last year or so at scale.
I mean, it's not something that I have much personal understanding of when I use a model. So, as we see things like Nextcloud adding some machine learning things into itself, and even on my phone, I'm now using a voice keyboard thing for when I'm sending messages on the go. And that's really useful to me. I've got a choice of different models, and they've got different complexities, and presumably they use different amounts of power, but I've got absolutely no idea what that is. And so if you don't have that information when you're making those decisions, it's really hard to influence your behavior with them.
It should be noted, we're not just talking about inference. Like, if you also download a model using something like Ollama or LM Studio and you run this locally, people still had to pay to train those models. That costs money, a lot of money, actually, and that has an impact too.
I do wonder if this is a story that's kind of flying under the radar for most people. I think AI in general's got a lot of controversy around it and concerns around taking jobs and artificial general intelligence risks, but just generally setting the planet more on fire is probably something we should be talking more about. Like 30% is a massive, massive increase for a cloud provider. Like, I really would love to understand what the actual impact of that's going to be.
Well, for me, this is my biggest concern about it right now. And I do feel like no one's talking about it. You're right.
Time for some free consulting, but before we do, a quick thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. If you'd like to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support, where for various amounts you can get ad-free feed of either this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows, and sometimes you get episodes early. If you have any questions or feedback, you can send those to show@hybridcloudshow.com. Matt writes, as a relative newbie to Azure, can you talk a bit about the different vulnerability and compliance tools that are available, please? You recently mentioned Wiz, which looks very good, but likely much too expensive for the solution I work on. For background, we're using Azure for web app hosting, VMs, and table/blob storage. So depending on what sort of level you want to start here, you can go all the way back to those kind of cloud adoption frameworks and the Azure Security Fundamentals kinds of pieces, where they will talk in really high levels about the kinds of things that you want to be considering if you are doing security on Azure. Those are a good idea to do if you have never gone there before, because they give you an idea where things like the more specific benchmarks and policy and so forth fits in. I think there is also a good reference around the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, which has more prescriptive stuff in there, and so you can go and find out a bit more there. The other thing I would call out is the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, which you might hear a bit about in the industry. So CIS is, I believe, a bit of a collaborative organization where people by consensus agree what the good security practices are, and then the CIS organization puts out a PDF, among other things, that is very long. I think the last one I looked at was over 100 pages long, of specific guidance about how to harden specific releases of operating systems. So there's one, for example, for Ubuntu 2004. And then those you can just read and apply yourself, or you can get tooling from various providers that will help you audit or apply CIS recommendations to your virtual machines.
The other thing worth mentioning there is that most of the big cloud providers have a CIS hardened image for all of the big Linux distros available. I know that on AWS you pay a slight licensing cost, and I think that goes back to the CIS actually to help fund it. But it's a very easy way of making sure that the image you're using has all of those CIS recommendations applied.
Yes, and there are some from the Linux distributions themselves. I know that Ubuntu has got at least one CIS image out there, and the different OS vendors often have hardening tools themselves. So again, Ubuntu's got them as part of the Ubuntu Pro offering. So I'm an Ubuntu member. I get 50 VMs or whatever free that I can harden with CIS and use the security tooling on. So that's something I do myself on my personal servers because it's a useful way of understanding which CIS recommendations aren't applied and to apply a large number of those CIS hardening rules before I start using that instance. They're normally based on the idea that you're starting from a fresh system and applying those hardenings before you then put your workload on and see what breaks.
The other thing I'd recommend looking at as a bare minimum is the built-in advisor tools that a lot of the cloud providers have. So Azure has Azure Advisor, AWS has AWS Trusted Advisor, and these are really good ways of just looking at the bare minimum of security things that you should be considering for your cloud workload. Say, thinking about security group rules or network security rules or things like that that you may not think about that should really be a bare minimum for operating a secure workload in the cloud.
Azure also has a thing called Azure Policy that's worth a look if you are an Azure house. I believe that's free for instances that are in Azure, and you pay if you're using it via Azure Arc on other cloud providers. That's an interesting policy audit compliance tooling that they offer that has a set of Linux baseline rules that are very similar or had their genesis in the CIS rules. And so if you're using that, you can use Azure Policy to apply the Linux baseline to your instances, and it will tell you which of those rules or recommendations are not being followed on those instances. And they give you a mechanism to have some exceptions to that and so forth.
Does that apply just to operating systems, or could you audit cloud resources as well?
I've only used it for virtual machines, but I believe that there are a set of policies around the app service and storage and things like that as well that you can use. CIS, I think, also is much bigger than just virtual machines, and that they have recommendations more generally for the cloud providers and so forth.
I know in AWS and GCP, you can at least use their advisor tools to choose different specifications for the security compliances you're targeting, and then they will do an analyze on your resources, including your VMs and all the cloud resources, to make sure that you follow those specific specifications.
Beyond hardening and this level of scanning, is there anything else anyone can think of? Hardening's great, but if you're installing a lot of vulnerabilities onto it, is there, and as well, these config rules and policy rules can have limitations. Like if I'm installing dangerous things in a box, like what is there in Azure to scan those and get results back or alerts back to say you're running a vulnerable system? Is anyone aware?
So you have Microsoft Defender, I believe, in the Azure ecosystem that will apply to cloud resources as well. But I think vulnerability scanning is a huge topic that's really hard, because the way that vulnerabilities work across the different operating systems is effectively self-declared by the different operating system vendors. And the way that the versions of the packages that sit on those operating systems tie into the upstream CVEs is also really complicated. And as a consequence, I haven't had great experiences looking at the CVE results that come out of a lot of the scanners, but that's effectively what everybody's stuck with.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets really difficult. And that's why I recommended using something like one of the advisors. Because if you're building on top of a CIS hardened image and you're getting all of the basics right in these advisor tools, you're at least some of the way there for the somewhat simple VM table storage workload that the listener sent in. Beyond that, there, like you say, is a whole bunch of stuff that you can do around specific vulnerability scanning. But I think you need to start somewhere, and making sure that you're ticking the box for all of the high and mediums on the advisor tool of your cloud of choice, making sure that you're at least following a level of CIS benchmark that's right for your workload and for your industry, probably gets you a long way to begin with.
And have a good strategy for updates for your operating system, however you're going to do that.
Yeah, and deeper than that, then you look at things like observability. How do you make sure that you know if there's something squiffy going on with the workload? How do you know if there's a sudden influx of traffic? all of that stuff, but it's probably a lot deeper than we can go into in this particular question.
Well, we better get out of here then. If you've got any feedback or questions, please do send those in to show@hybridcloudshow.com. And please do share this podcast if you like it. Tell a friend who might be interested. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.